Chapter 3. The Routine. Ever since the initial invasion, most of the world's metropolises either had active military units patrolling or safeguarding them, or had paid their respective governments to build new military bases within, or just outside of, the city limits. New York had opted for both. Because New York housed some of the world's most advanced institutions on nanotechnology, AI research, and arcane sciences, the city council had authorized the construction of Fort Lafayette. The fort, which was a minor city unto itself, straddled the southeastern edge of New York City and housed almost 1 million servicemen and women. Fort Lafayette was a true maze of red tape, as it was home to New York City's personal legion of Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, Eldritch Defense Force, Marines, and Navy. All 6 of America's military branches shared space in an area of 117 square miles, a quarter of the size of New York as it had been at the turn of the 21st century. Lafayette's surface structure was similar to the tip of an iceberg. Underground facilities spanning almost the entire width of the surface level ran 4 levels deep, each level 100 feet in height or larger. Interdepartmental relations within the fort were an entirely different beast compared to what some of the city's many departments went through. Aside from the small army of secretaries, secretarial AIs, civilian components, and officer corps, Fort Lafayette was host to a fully sentient AI named Zeus. Zeus was a marvel of modern technology, totally aware and capable of handling the raw computing power it took to schedule things from incoming shipments and traffic to multi-branch meetings and maintenance schedules for the fort's thousands of vehicles. It was a modern marvel, all right, but Sergeant Marcus Santiago couldn't give a damn. Zeus kept things moving smoothly, but even it couldn't account for stupid. "It's not a matter of doing the job," the lightly brown-furred mouse tried to explain. "It's doing it at every little hiccup the spooks have and thinking it's some kind of emergency." Spooks was a term the average soldier used to refer to anyone with paranormal abilities such as psionics or sorcerers. The connotation was obvious. People who could do those sorts of things were spooky. "So a couple of spooks got a headache, who the hell cares?" he grumbled as he set the magnetic clasps to his greaves. "It wasn't just some of the spooks, Twiggy," Sergeant James Litz replied, using Marcus's nickname within the unit. James and Marcus were called the Brothers because they were the same height and build, standing at 5'9" and weighing in around 150 pounds each. The only difference between them was the color of their fur. Where Marcus was a light brown, James was splotchy orange and white. They shared the same hazel eye color. It was every Damus and Merlin that was taking a peek in the whole damn city. Even the ones here in Fayette got their fairy tale asses handed to them. Damus, short for Nostradamus, the famous 16th century apothecary who made predictions about the future, was slang for a psionic, as they tended to be able to predict certain things on a subconscious or even conscious level, such as the way someone might step around them, toss an object toward them, or even what they would say. Merlin was in reference to the wizard who was once thought to be the fictional companion to King Arthur and was used as slang for most magic wielders. Discoveries made within the last few centuries had proven Merlin to have existed, and his book of spells was rooted in advanced Eldritch studies. Since both psionics and sorcerers came in many different varieties, simple catch-all terms were far easier to remember than the differences between a clairsentient and precognizant. Marcus shook his head as he grabbed his helmet, tucking it under his arm and hefting his ST-5J assault rifle. "Still, what's it to us? They all get a headache at once, so we have to double up patrols?" All around them, males and females were scrambling to get into their combat gear, grab their weapons, and make their way to their designated transport. Once the AWC had sounded a general alarm and Fort Lafayette's own scryers had been incapacitated, Zeus had sent out general orders to the fort to begin putting extra patrols in the city, for sweeps to be made of the rivers and bay, and for an increase in air, naval, and warding presence. In situations like these, Marine units would be placed at key transportation hubs such as subway and railway stations, while Army units would begin making patrols through the city. Coast Guard vessels would patrol the rivers and bay. The Navy would sweep Long Island Sound and the deep coastal waters, and the Air Force would maintain a presence in low atmosphere, ready to strike at anything that wasn't authorized within the city's airspace. "The hell are we having this conversation for, Twiggy?" James asked as the two jogged to a wisp mark. 3. A new low-atmosphere vehicle LAV that had a narrow rear compartment, a larger, rounded cockpit, and thin wings with 4 propellers built into the wings themselves. The propellers didn't suck air through. Instead, they harnessed the astral energies emitted from Earth's LA lines, allowing the Wisp to move at 5 times the speed of sound at its pushing point, while still being extremely maneuverable. Because of the extreme speeds and pressure the aircraft put on their pilots and passengers, most pilots these days were also sorcerers. A vehicle's pilot would focus on piloting, while co-pilots focused on maintaining protective barrier spells to keep everyone inside from being crushed by the fatal pressures that high-speed maneuvers could bring about. Weapons and enemy sighting, tracking, as well as other such responsibilities were handed over to virtual intelligence suits, allowing for faster reaction times that organic pilots simply couldn't bring to the table. "If something was big enough to take out that many scryers all at once, we have to be on the lookout," James said as he and Marcus locked themselves into their personnel drop slots. Unlike the old days when ground troops would simply hop out of a hovering or landed helicopter, or drop down via ropes, aircraft now had designated areas for troops to stand. These areas were made up of specifically programmed nanomachines, while under normal operating situations the nanites clung together to be as hard and indistinguishable as the rest of a transport's hull. When the time came for troops to clear the transport, an electronic signal was sent, and the nanites loosened their grip on one another to create a hole through which troops would fall. The instant a troop passed through the slot, the nanites grouped back together to form a solid bulkhead once again. A green light flashed in the compartment as the rest of the Marines locked themselves into place. There was the familiar sinking feeling as the Wisp lifted itself from the ground, and the ley line drive kicked in. The only indication of movement was the vibrating sensation coming from the bulkheads and through the Marines' combat suits as air surged around the Wisp. A Wisp's speed made for very short trips into the city proper, and, in less than a minute, pairs of Marines were dropped off at key locations. Larger 5 or 10 man squads were rarely needed anymore for anything other than actual ground war combat. Armored soldiers carried such devastating weaponry and wore armor tough enough to take a 20th century rocket to the chest that a pair of Marines could easily hold a position from standard enemies for hours on end without backup. In the case of Outworlder activity, mental codes could be sent to call for reinforcements which would arrive within 2 minutes should the need arise. So it was that when it came to their stop, Marcus and James fell through their drop slots some 30 feet from the ground, the Wisp barely slowing. The two landed on a cleared area of sidewalk, hitting the ground hard and bending their knees. Shock absorbers in their armor gathered the kinetic energy from the impact and sent it hissing through vents in the armor on the back of their calves, up their back, and on the back of their biceps. 2,000 pounds of armored Marines had slammed into Plascrete sidewalk at 250 miles per hour, and there wasn't a crack to be shown for it. James grinned beneath his helmet as his heads-up display began feeding him overlaid schematics of his surroundings, the number of civilians in the area, the schedule for the nearby subway station, and other data that might be of any use. Troop chatter was already filling the communications link, giving all clears and good to goes as they arrived and secured their designated areas. James hollered over his and Marcus's private channel, "Damn, I love that part!" Marcus nodded in agreement, then activated the loudspeakers on his armor as civilians began to gather close to get a look at the two. His voice came out like thunder. "Ladies and gentlemen, please go about your business. There has been an incident, but there is currently no threat, immediate or otherwise, to concern yourself over." The announcement was a pre-written catch-all. Obviously, there was an incident or they wouldn't be there. And considering the fact that this was New York, the media was already all over the AWC trying to get quotes and footage. A quick check of any news feed proved that much. Still, protocol was protocol, and the announcement had to be made. Most people didn't care. They just wanted a closer look at the Marines in their armor. As the two armored mice began moving, the crowd parted and started to go on with their business. $50 says we're not here an hour, Marcus said over the private channel. An icon with the universal credit symbol popped up over the information feeds on James's overlay. He smirked behind his helmet and gave it a mental confirmed button. A smaller number in the far right corner of his vision showed the deduction of the credits from his account and the total 100 being put into a temporary betting account. "You're on, Twiggy. Nothing like this is going to take an hour. We'll be here till at least 5. "Whatever you say. You want the street or the platform?" James sighed. "Hell, I feel like a walk." He gave Marcus a pat on the shoulder as he descended the stairs to the subway and switched to the general channel. "This is Sergeant Litz checking in for .18 Charlie Mike Kilo. We are in position and all clear. Nothing to report." He tagged their position as all clear as he called out over the channel. His armored boots stomped down the Plascrete steps. He turned left as the stairs opened up and continued to follow them down. He could have used the escalators, of course, but anything that took a bit more time would help get the day over with sooner. Civilians gave him a wide berth, adults casting all sorts of looks his way. The military was becoming a common sight in the city since the initial invasion a few years ago, and not everyone was pleased. There were always veterans in the crowd giving approving nods or tossing casual salutes his way. Kids were hit or miss, really. Where one child was excited to see his armored form pacing about or guarding an area, another might be too scared to want to go near him. Boys always seemed to want to shoot his gun, though. On the turn in the stairs, a small boy squirrel wrestled his hand free of his mother's with an excited squeal upon seeing him. The child laughed and ran up to him, staring up in awe for a moment before a mischievous grin appeared and he pointed up at James with his fingers pointed in the shape of a gun. The child let loose a series of mock gun sounds, and James played along, grabbing at his chest and stumbling back to crumple against the wall, getting chuckles and laughs from those around him. The boy jumped up and down, laughing in his triumph. James pushed himself from the wall to pat the boy gently on the head. His voice boomed from the speakers. "Hold the line, lil' buddy." The adults around him covered their ears from the close proximity of the loudspeakers, but the boy weathered it with a giant grin and a youthful laugh. James pat the boy on the shoulder, gave the mother a polite nod, then continued his way down the stairs. The subway station opened up before him suddenly as his head cleared the ceiling. A huge crowd of people mingled about. They were doing everything from shopping, talking, and arguing to playing with kids, selling cheap merchandise to simply waiting for the train. A nearby couple, a male canine mix and a female rabbit, were necking until the rabbit noticed James. She swatted her unobservant boyfriend, who must have thought there was some homeless person leering at them. He turned around, chest puffed out, and a look that James could only guess was his "I'm dangerous" face. The male quickly deflated after taking notice of James in his armor and carrying his ST-5J. He grabbed the rabbit by the arm and the pair made themselves scarce, probably to find another corner to make out in. James looked around for a minute to find a piece of real estate to call his own. He decided to post up in between the stairs and the closest pillar. No sooner had he gotten comfortable than a camera came around to hover in front of him, a light snapping on and a rather slim Siamese cat in a very smart, dark mauve business suit, and a harness which her camera would anchor itself to until there was a story to cover appeared in the camera's wake. He sighed inside his suit. He couldn't stand the press. The cat smiled, very charming but with some underlying purpose. "Good afternoon, Sergeant. I'm Lori Wu with NYCStreetBeat.com, where we roam the streets of New York for live news wherever it's happening. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" James sighed inside his armor again. He really did hate the press, especially the roaming.com reporters. He activated his suit's speakers with a mental click. "One moment, ma'am." He did a quick mental search for information they were allowed to relay to any press that happened to ask, because they would. And if you didn't give them something, they'd make it all up and paint the military up as an occupying force trying to subjugate the city. Standing a bit straighter as he found the information, James asked, "How can I help you?" Street side, Marcus had taken to standing to the side of the subway entrance, his rifle on safety and held in front of him across his chest. A tourist group had stopped and began taking pictures and videos of him. While there weren't any more clunky cameras to lug around any longer, people simply looked at what they wanted to snap a shot of or video. He knew because while he was in his armor, they had to send requests directly to him to see if they could keep the images or video. One great part about the armor was that while something as perfectly harmless as taking a picture with one's beck was, you still had to request permission to be able to have the information stored about certain things like advanced military armor and weapons systems. His armor wasn't top of the line anymore. In fact, it was a generation old. But a single generation of military armor was still considered high-tech, so it stayed on the list for requests. If the request was denied, a person's bex would either delete the image or video, or would completely blur out the restricted item to make it indistinguishable. Traffic was a nightmare as usual. Why people even bothered was beyond him. Even with 7 layers of low atmosphere designated as travel pathways through the city's airspace, there was still back-to-back traffic. Sure, you got the occasional idiot who would fly in open air, but those guys always got busted and their licenses revoked for a while. It was really difficult to break a traffic law these days when the 6 in the vehicle reported everything you did to the local authority net. Something was going on across the street, some sort of gathering or rally. A group of several individuals done up in makeup and matching Medoth wear, a style that mixed medieval and gothic punk trappings for a very "I live in the perpetual gutter but I still rebel against my parents while I live in their basement or attic" look. Marcus shook his head. He couldn't quite make out what they were saying as they were flailing their arms about in the midst of some hectic. Was that dancing or some crazy gesturing? Maybe his audio sensors were off. He'd have them checked when he got back. He continued to watch the group as the time on his wager icon ticked away the minutes. This crap happened so often now it had become routine. He hated the routine. Routine made you complacent. Complacency could get you killed. Screw the routine. He wanted something to happen for once, if for no other reason than to kill the routine.